In this video, we're going to take a look at a fun drawing challenge, and that's drawing super tiny. In this demonstration, I'm working on Bristol paper and I'm using the vellum surface. This means that there is a small amount of tooth on the paper, but it's still relatively smooth. Now, Bristol paper is a heavier paper, meaning that it's a little bit thicker, and it's going to be able to accept some wash applications that we're going to apply with watercolor, somewhat as an underpainting to develop this drawing. Now, I'm starting here with a 6H pencil, and I'm using a very, very light touch. I don't typically use H pencils because the graphite is so hard in them that they can produce grooves in the surface of the paper, but I'm very barely touching the surface here with these marks. I'm just planning out the shapes of the bee that we're drawing here, and I'm putting some indications of the details. Of course, most of the details are going to be developed as we layer watercolor washes and colored pencil applications over the top. Now that we've got our basic shapes in place with the graphite applications, I'm going to begin to layer watercolor applications. I'm using a mixture of a dark blue and a dark brown to produce this darker gray here. We're going to produce the nice rich blacks by applying colored pencil applications, but applying these early watercolor applications really provides for a nice base from which we can layer on top of. Now, you might be wondering, why should I do a super tiny drawing like this? After all, it's much easier to produce highly representational or realistic results when you work on a much larger surface. Well, simply the first reason is because it's just fun. It's interesting to look at a tiny drawing on a larger sheet of drawing paper. Plus, it's a great challenge. It forces you to really work tiny, obviously, but it forces you to really think about how the colors and values that you put on the surface are going to create the illusion of the object that you're drawing with just a little bit more distance. This will clearly carry over into the larger drawings that you create, forcing you almost to consider the details a little bit more, which will ultimately lead to a greater quality of realism in those larger drawings. We'll apply a very light wash of yellow ochre to both of the wings. Although the wings are transparent, there is a bit of color associated with them. And I'm going to leave a couple of open areas for highlights where the light is reflecting off of the wings. Now, these early watercolor washes, of course, as I mentioned before, are merely an underpainting. We're going to be layering the colored pencil applications over the top. The only exception is the area of shadow that happens underneath the bee. A very light wash is applied here, extending out from each one of the legs and the abdomen. Now we're ready to start applying some of the colored pencil applications. Of course, I've allowed the watercolor applications to dry completely before applying colored pencils. We'll start by preserving the areas of highlight using a white colored pencil. I'm using Prismacolor Premier colored pencils as well as Derwent Studio colored pencils for this demonstration. The Prismacolor Premier pencils are really my favorite colored pencils. They're nice and soft and waxy, but for a tiny drawing like this, they become dull very quickly, and I find myself constantly sharpening them. The Derwent pencils are just a slight bit harder, meaning that they're going to keep their sharp tip just a little bit longer. Mainly, I'll be using the Derwent brand pencil for the areas of black. I've found that the Derwent line has a black that is a little bit more natural and not quite as strong. The Prismacolor line creates a black that's very strong and can be overpowering. Typically, I avoid black altogether, but with a very tiny drawing like this, sometimes you just have to apply the black instead of trying to mix it on the surface. Just as I would with a larger drawing, I'm considering the strokes that I make with the colored pencil applications. In this case, I'm pulling strokes outward from the body of the bee to help indicate the illusion of fur. I'll also use the black to increase the contrast on the bottom portion of the wing that's closest to the viewer. A heavy application of black is applied to each of the legs of the bee, leaving space for a strong highlight so that this section looks reflective. We'll continue working applying colored pencil applications from the left to the right. A few marks are added for the stripes that are visible through the wings before developing the bottom portion of the hind leg and the back end of the abdomen. Now, a slight indication of some of the fur is visible on this back portion of the abdomen where we have the stripes. So I'll make directional marks following the cross contours of the abdomen in this section with both the yellow and the black applications. Now, as far as the yellow pencil goes, I'm initially starting with a yellow ochre, and this is a Prismacolor Premier pencil. We're going to develop the oranges and the yellows basically with just two different colors, and that again is yellow ochre, and now at this point I'm using a bit of goldenrod. Now, of course, you're not seeing this in the video, but I am sharpening my pencil quite often. In fact, I'll just make a few marks before I need to sharpen it again, especially when I'm developing these areas in the midsection and in the abdomen of the bee where we have those furry parts that are coming out from the body. Now, at this point, I'm just going to continue to develop layering the pencils there as I see fit. I might burnish a few areas with some applications of white. Now, of course, another option is to use a colorless blender to burnish sections, but because this drawing is so small, I don't really feel like it's totally necessary to burnish the entire drawing. Just a few white applications here and there do the job. Now, there is a bit of yellow fur coming off of each of the legs, so I'm just going to kind of put an indication of this by putting a little bit of a yellow haze around some of the legs, and of course the segments in between do have a yellowish hue. I used the yellow ochre for this, and then now at the very bottom of each one of these legs there is a small little piece that has a little bit more of a brown tint. So for this application, I'm using a raw umber. Again, this is the Prismacolor Premier pencil. I'm also going to use this color to define some of the details in the wings. Now, I've sharpened this pencil as sharp as I can possibly get it with my pencil sharpener. I could always go back in with a blade and make the tip a little bit sharper if I needed to. But I'm just going to put a light indication of some of the shadows that happen within the complexities of each one of the wings with this raw umber. Now, it would be real easy to get carried away here, making all these little intricate patterns and things that happen on the wings, but really we just want an indication of where the wings are, and we want to make sure that we preserve that transparency in each one of the wings so we don't have to describe everything completely. Next, we'll take a little bit of water with a nylon brush and just soften up some of the edges that happen with the cast shadow underneath the bee. We don't need to have those hard edges that were originally created, and by using just a little bit of water, we can scrub those edges away. Alright, now I'm just going to intensify some of the black that happens on the antenna, and I'll also take a bit of the white and intensify some of the areas of highlight a bit, especially in the area of the wings. I might just go over some of these sections here just to make the colors that are coming through just a little bit more muted so that it feels a little bit more like a transparent bee wing. We'll continue working on some of these sections within the areas of the wings and develop some of the colors that happen underneath the wing. Of course, we're not going to be able to see all of the details through the wing because light is hitting the wing and reflecting light back off of it, creating areas of highlight. So we're careful to leave those sections, but a few of the colors, of course, can be intensified. We'll add a little bit of core shadow on the bottom portion of the abdomen with a bit of that black, and then we can continue to develop some of those furry marks that come off the head of the bee. Now we'll add a few furry marks that happen on the abdomen of the bee as well. Of course, this bee is pretty darn furry all the way around, even on the legs. And speaking of the legs, we'll go back and just intensify the black just a little bit further to create a little bit more contrast between the highlights and the dark areas that happen there. Now, of course, there are 3 other legs on the other side of the bee, and in this case, we can only see a part of that very hind leg over there on the right side. So we'll give it a little bit of an indication of that with some black and some of the raw umber. And then we can go back inside and just intensify again the darks and the lights, a little bit more black on the bottom of the wing. And then at the very tip of the abdomen, there is a little bit of a white line that segments that last stripe from the very end. Again, with the raw umber, we'll define a few more details in the wings, and then our super tiny drawing is complete. We can compare it to a quarter right here and compare it to a dime, so it's super small. So again, the reason why you would do this is just because it is fun, number one, and number two, and probably more importantly, it's going to help you with your larger drawings if you put this into practice. If you do a small little tiny drawing, it won't take you long to do so. It'll really force you to have superior control over your materials and concentrate on the details that you see, and of course this will carry over into your larger drawings, making them even more impressive.